My name is Margaret Hale. I'm writing this slowly with care because what I experienced did not arrive with force or urgency. It came gently, as if it had been waiting for me to quiet down enough to notice it. I was 42 years old at the time, working in organizational consulting, the kind of work that lives in calendars, conversations, and constant decision-making. My days were usually full, not chaotic, just busy in a way that leaves little room for silence. I was used to thinking ahead, solving problems before they fully appeared, carrying responsibility with competence and calm. That morning began like any other. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window as the city slowly woke up. Nothing dramatic. No unusual thoughts. No sense that anything meaningful was approaching. If anything, the morning felt quieter than usual, but not in a way that concerned me. Still, something felt different. Not heavy. Not emotional. Just slower. As if my thoughts were moving at a more deliberate pace, pausing between themselves instead of racing forward. I noticed the warmth of the mug in my hands. The way the light rested on the floor instead of passing through unnoticed. Even the sound of traffic felt distant, less demanding. Normally, my mind would already be planning the day. Emails. Meetings. Conversations that hadn't happened yet. But that morning, my attention stayed with what was right in front of me. It felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. My husband passed through the room and asked casually, "Are you feeling okay today?" "I think so," I replied. The words were true but incomplete. I felt fine, yet I was aware of something underneath that didn't have language yet. I wasn't worried about it. I simply noticed it and let it be. Later that morning, while sitting quietly on the couch, I felt a gentle warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't physical discomfort. It didn't interrupt my breathing or demand attention. It felt more like awareness itself waking up, like something inside me was becoming present in a new way. Something feels important, I thought. I didn't analyze it. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't try to label the sensation. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to myself. Time passed, though I couldn't tell how much. My phone vibrated somewhere nearby and I let it go unanswered. Silence felt right. Not empty but purposeful, like a space being prepared. Then I noticed how still my body felt. Not weak. Not numb. Just ready to rest. "I'm going to sit for a moment," I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. As I leaned back, effort seemed to fade. My breathing continued naturally, steady and unforced. Instead of becoming foggy or distant, my thoughts grew clearer. Slower. More complete. I remember thinking, this feels intentional. The room didn't disappear. Sounds didn't stop. But my attention shifted inward, as if something deeper was opening without resistance. I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind. I felt like I was entering something more honest. There was no fear. I expected uncertainty, maybe even panic, but neither came. What settled instead was a calm so steady it didn't ask for reassurance. My body felt deeply at rest, yet my awareness felt sharper than ever. "Is this okay?" I wondered. The answer didn't arrive as words. It arrived as understanding, whole and immediate. "You are safe." I felt held, not physically but in a way that reached deeper than physical sensation. There was no struggle. No sense of loss. No urgency to return or to go further. It wasn't escape. It was presence without pressure. And in that stillness, I realized how rarely I allowed myself to be fully present without needing to manage, fix, or prepare. How often I confused peace with avoidance. This was different. This was rest that remained connected to life. My awareness began to turn toward something welcoming. Not pulling. Not demanding. Simply inviting. The calm grew warmer, deeper, like standing in sunlight that doesn't burn. I didn't know where this was leading. And for the first time in a long while, not knowing felt completely acceptable. That was when everything gently began to change. I could still hear the world around me. Voices moved somewhere nearby, softened, as if layered behind a curtain of calm. Someone said my name gently, without urgency. It sounded familiar and distant at the same time. "Margaret." I wanted to answer out loud, but instead I responded inwardly. "I'm here." What surprised me most was how natural that felt. There was no effort involved, no sense of strain. My body remained completely still, yet my awareness felt fully awake. Clear, focused, unrushed. I noticed how different this clarity was from the kind I experienced during busy days. That clarity usually came from control, from organizing thoughts and prioritizing tasks. This clarity came from the absence of pressure. Nothing was asking anything of me. I wondered briefly if I should be concerned. If this was something I needed to interrupt or explain. But that thought passed quickly, not because it was answered but because it no longer felt important. Understanding arrived instead. You don't need to manage this. That realization settled gently. I wasn't doing anything right or wrong. I wasn't achieving anything. I was simply present in a way I hadn't been in a long time. My attention continued to turn inward, not sharply, but like a lens slowly adjusting its focus. I didn't feel separated from my body. I felt less dependent on it to define where awareness existed. That's interesting, I thought, almost amused. Unfinished plans didn't trouble me. Responsibilities didn't pull at my attention. Even people I loved appeared in my awareness without the usual trace of concern attached to them. Everything felt accounted for, as if nothing essential was at risk. Time felt different. Not stopped. Not gone. Just widened. Why does everything feel slower? I wondered. Because you are not rushing past yourself here. That understanding landed without resistance. I saw how much of my life had been spent moving ahead of my own experience, anticipating instead of inhabiting. Here there was no need to hurry. The stillness deepened. It didn't isolate me. It connected me more fully to what mattered. I could sense attention itself becoming quieter, more attentive, less scattered. It felt like standing in a wide field without needing to choose a direction. Then I became aware of a presence. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It didn't announce itself or demand recognition. It simply felt unmistakable, like recognizing a familiar voice before realizing who is speaking. There was patience in it. Calm authority. A steadiness that didn't need to prove itself. I understood who was present before any image formed. Jesus. Not as a figure first, not as a memory or symbol, but as a living presence marked by gentleness and clarity. There was no judgment in that recognition. No examination. Only being known without being inspected. You felt the shift already, the understanding conveyed. Yes, I responded immediately. I didn't yet know what it meant, but the response felt honest. It means awareness is rising. The words didn't sound like a warning or an ending. They carried no urgency. They pointed towards something unfolding rather than something breaking apart. Relief moved through me, quiet and complete. I realized then how often I had associated spiritual experiences with intensity or fear. This was neither. This felt grounded, steady, deeply personal. There was no sense of distance between us. No hierarchy pressing down. Only presence meeting presence. I didn't ask how long this would last. I didn't ask what would happen next. Those questions didn't arise because nothing felt missing. In that stillness, I understood something simple and profound at the same time. Faith was not meant to be strained or forced. It was meant to be rested into. Prayer was not meant to fill silence. It was meant to grow out of it. And love for God did not feel like effort. It felt like recognition. Time no longer felt like something I was inside. It felt like something I was observing from a calm distance without needing to measure it or move with it. There was no sense of waiting. No anticipation. Just a steady awareness that allowed everything to be exactly as it was. I noticed how often in ordinary life time feels like a force. Something that pulls, pushes, and pressures. Here it felt generous. Spacious. As if there was room for each moment to finish before the next one arrived. Why does it feel like this? I wondered. Because you are not being pulled by time here. That understanding settled gently. I saw how much of my usual sense of urgency came from fear of falling behind, of missing something important. In this stillness, nothing important felt fragile. My awareness widened again, and with it came a subtle emphasis. Not sharp. Not alarming. Just clear. A year came into focus. Not as a date circled on a calendar. Not as a prediction or an event. It appeared more like a tone, a feeling held longer than the others. The year was 2027. This feels significant, I thought. Yes, came the calm response, but not in the way people expect. I understood that the importance of this time would not come from dramatic external changes. It wouldn't be defined by headlines or singular moments. It would be defined by how people felt while moving through their everyday lives. People will feel different, the understanding conveyed. Not broken. Not lost. Restless in a quiet way. Reflective. less satisfied by surface distractions that once worked well enough to keep deeper questions away. I sensed that many people would wake up feeling slightly out of rhythm, unsure why familiar routines felt heavier than before. Not overwhelmed but no longer comforted by the usual noise. They will think something is wrong with them, I realized. Some will, came the gentle reply until they recognized that awareness is asking for space. That distinction mattered. This wasn't about fear or collapse. It was about attention shifting inward, values quietly rearranging themselves without announcement. I saw how discomfort would often be treated as a problem to fix instead of a signal to listen. How people would search outward for explanations, opinions, constant input, when the guidance they needed was already forming within them. This isn't meant to scare anyone, I thought. No, the understanding agreed. Fear narrows vision. This season requires expansion. I felt peace settle deeper inside me. The message wasn't urgent. It wasn't demanding action. It was grounding. I noticed then how often faith had been framed as certainty, as having answers ready. Here faith felt different. It felt like trust in stillness. Trust that God does not rush what is meant to grow. Prayer came to mind not as words spoken but as attention offered. Prayer, I realized, was less about asking for outcomes and more about aligning with presence. Being willing to listen without filling the silence. Being willing to love God without needing immediate reassurance. I sensed that many people would feel tired during this time without knowing why. Not physically tired but weary of pretending. Weary of rushing. Weary of maintaining surfaces that no longer reflected what was happening inside them. This explains so much, I thought quietly. Yes, came the response. Because what is familiar is loosening. People often confuse familiarity with safety, I realized. When familiarity fades, fear rushes in to fill the space. But fear wasn't necessary here. What was needed was faith that did not panic. Faith that trusted God even when clarity arrived slowly. Faith that allowed prayer to be simple and honest rather than performative. Love for God, I understood, would become less about language and more about orientation. Less about convincing and more about returning. Returning to what felt steady, true, and quietly sustaining. This shift won't arrive all at once, I sensed. It would move gently, person by person, conversation by conversation, choice by choice. Those who notice it early won't be ahead, I thought. They will simply be listening. That felt right. I didn't feel called to announce anything. There was no message to broadcast. No instruction to persuade or prepare others. The understanding felt deeply personal, meant to be lived rather than explained. Soon my awareness began to narrow slightly, not withdrawing, just refocusing. Sensation hovered at the edges again, waiting patiently. Before that movement completed, one final understanding settled clearly. Salvation does not come through noise. It comes through faith that trusts God in the quiet. Through prayer that listens as much as it speaks. Through love that remains steady when certainty feels distant. That understanding didn't feel heavy. It felt like rest. As that understanding settled, my awareness shifted gently toward the idea of influence. Not influence as ambition. Not power or control. Influence as presence. I noticed how attention naturally moved toward people who speak, lead, or are seen by others. Not because they seek attention but because attention already rests on them. Their words travel farther. Their tone lingers longer. Even their silence can shape how others feel. What about leaders? I wondered. The understanding formed calmly. Leadership will feel heavier in this season. Not because leaders will be blamed. Not because outcomes will suddenly depend on them alone. But because influence carries weight when people are already unsettled. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about positions or titles. It was about emotional impact. I saw how words spoken casually could ripple outward more strongly than intended. How reactions could amplify tension without meaning to. How calm, when embodied sincerely, could ease rooms without explanation. Leadership is not about control, the understanding conveyed. It is about steadiness. That truth settled deeply. I understood that in seasons of interchange, people look less for certainty and more for grounding. Less for confident answers and more for someone who isn't rushed by uncertainty. Tone will matter more than volume. That stood out clearly. Loudness would not bring clarity. Speed would not bring reassurance. What people would respond to most was presence that did not react impulsively. I saw how easily fear spreads when someone reacts instead of responds. How quickly unease multiplies when urgency replaces attentiveness. Fear narrows vision, the understanding reminded me. Calm expands it. I felt peace settle again. There was no judgment in what I was being shown. No criticism. Just clarity. An invitation to recognize responsibility without turning it into pressure. This is about responsibility, I said quietly. Yes, came the calm reply, but not burden. That distinction mattered. Responsibility here did not mean carrying outcomes. It meant choosing how to show up. Choosing whether to add noise or reduce it. Whether to react or pause. Whether to speak from fear or from faith. Faith, I realized, was not passive here. Faith was active trust. Trust that God remains present even when answers are incomplete. Trust that prayer does not require urgency to be sincere. Trust that love does not need to convince to be powerful. I sensed that many people with influence would feel this weight without having language for it. They would feel the urge to speak quickly, to fill space, to reassure before listening. But the invitation was different. Pause. Respond intentionally. This feels simple, I thought. Simple does not mean easy, came the reply. Choosing calm would require restraint. Choosing prayer would require humility. Choosing love would require patience when reaction felt more natural. I understood then that salvation, as it was being shown to me, was not dramatic rescue. It was quiet realignment. A return to faith that trusts God beyond appearances. To prayer that remains when nothing is resolved yet. To love that steadies rather than overwhelms. Those who live this, I sensed, would quietly help others feel steadier too. Not by convincing them. Not by correcting them. But by being present in a way that does not add tension. You do not need to convince anyone, the understanding conveyed. Be present. That felt relieving. The experience wasn't asking me to carry a message loudly. It wasn't asking me to prepare arguments or explanations. It was asking me to live differently, to let faith shape my pace, prayer shape my attention, and love shape my responses. As that realization settled, I felt awareness begin to narrow again. Gently. Patiently. Like a lens preparing to refocus. Stillness remained, not as silence, but as attention without interference. And in that stillness I felt anchored. What became clear next was the importance of stillness. Not silence as absence. Not withdrawal from life. Stillness as attention without interference. I noticed how quiet everything felt around me, yet the quiet wasn't empty. It felt full, like the pause between meaningful words. Like space that allows understanding to arrive without being pushed. Why does stillness feel so important now? I wondered. The understanding formed gently. Because this is where people will hear themselves again. That felt immediately true. In ordinary life, stillness often feels uncomfortable. We fill it quickly with sound, plans, movement, distraction. Not because we enjoy the noise, but because listening inward can feel unfamiliar, even risky. In the season ahead, stillness will feel strange before it feels natural. I saw how many people would try to outrun that feeling at first. They would stay busy, scroll longer, talk louder, consume more information, hoping something external would quiet the restlessness underneath. But it wouldn't. Stillness wasn't asking people to stop living. It was asking them to stop rushing past themselves. To let life catch up to awareness. I realized how often I had ignored subtle inner signals. Hesitation. Quiet knowing. A sense that something wasn't aligned. Slowing down had always felt like falling behind. Here stillness felt like alignment. This is where clarity begins, I thought. Yes, came the calm response. Not in reaction but in reflection. I sensed that those who allow small moments of stillness, pausing before responding, sitting quietly without distraction, praying without filling the space with words, would feel steadier as others felt unsettled. Prayer came into focus again, not as repetition but as relationship. Not as performance but as presence. Prayer as staying with God long enough for fear to soften and trust to surface. I understood then that prayer does not always change circumstances. Sometimes it changes posture. It teaches the heart how to rest in God instead of bracing against uncertainty. It teaches the mind how to wait without panic. It teaches love how to remain gentle when answers are slow. Stillness wasn't withdrawal. It was preparation. What stood out most was the continued absence of fear. I had expected urgency. Warnings. A sense that something needed to be prevented or fixed. Instead, everything remained measured, calm, grounded. Why isn't fear part of this? I asked. The response came immediately. Fear shortens attention. This requires expansion. That truth settled deeply. Fear pushes people into reaction. It speeds decisions before understanding can form. What was being shown to me required patience, not panic. I saw how fear-based messages often pull people away from their own inner guidance. People search outward for reassurance instead of turning toward God with honesty and trust. That wouldn't help anyone, I thought. Exactly, came the reply. The shift people were sensing did not need alarm. It needed steadiness. People would feel unsettled not because something harmful was approaching, but because something familiar was loosening its hold. Old motivations would stop working. Old distractions would lose their comfort. Fear would only make that process harsher. Faith would soften it. I understood then that peace is not passive. It is intentional. Choosing calm is choosing clarity. And clarity grows best in patient spaces. As this understanding deepened, certain values came into focus. Not new ones. Forgotten ones. Kindness. Honesty. Presence. They felt almost too simple. They are simple, came the gentle reply. And that is why they matter now. I saw how often people chase complexity when simplicity feels too quiet to be important. Yet quiet consistency would be what steadied people most. Not perfect plans. Not confident answers. But how people treated one another in moments of uncertainty. Listening instead of correcting. Pausing instead of reacting. Choosing sincerity over performance. This wasn't about changing everything. It was about changing how we show up. That realization settled quietly, like a deep breath that reaches places you didn't realize were tense. And I felt ready to return. The movement toward returning began softly. Not abruptly. Not with resistance. It felt like awareness gently narrowing, the way a lens refocuses without losing clarity. Nothing was taken away. Nothing was rushed. The stillness remained, but it no longer felt boundless. It felt carried. You'll return now, the understanding conveyed. Not with answers. With orientation. That felt right. I didn't feel disappointment. I didn't feel the need to hold on. There was no fear of losing what had been shown to me. It felt complete, as if everything essential had already settled where it needed to be. Will I remember all of this? I wondered. You'll remember what you need, came the reply. That was enough. Gratitude rose, not emotional or overwhelming, but steady and grounding. Gratitude without urgency. Gratitude that didn't need expression to be real. Sensation began to return slowly. Breath first. Then sound. Then the gentle awareness of weight. My body felt familiar again, not foreign or heavy. Awareness settled back into form without friction, without haste. Nothing snapped into place. Everything eased. The final understanding remained clear as everything else softened. Live attentively. Choose faith when certainty feels distant. Let prayer remain even when words fall away. Let love guide how you meet the world. There was no instruction to convince anyone. No task to complete. No message to carry loudly. Just a way of being to live into, quietly, consistently. As my eyes opened, the room looked exactly the same. The light through the window hadn't changed. The sounds were familiar. The ordinary world had not paused in my absence. And yet, I knew something within me had shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly. It felt like a compass settling into true north. My husband was nearby. He looked at me carefully, concern mixed with relief. You were so still, he said softly. I know, I replied. But I felt peaceful. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Calm, grounded, present. As I sat up slowly, sensation returned fully. The weight of my hands. The rhythm of my breathing. The quiet awareness of being present in my body again. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt delayed. I noticed how much attention I gave to small details. The way the air felt on my skin. The pauses between words. The gentle movements of people nearby. I wasn't trying to interpret the experience yet. I wasn't assigning meaning or conclusions. I was simply here. Later, standing by the window again, I looked out at the street below. Cars moved. People walked. Life continued exactly as it had before. Yet it felt closer somehow. Like I was finally meeting it instead of moving past it. You seem different, my husband said carefully. I feel different, I replied after a pause. Not changed. Just clearer. That felt true. I wasn't excited or shaken. I wasn't searching for meaning. The meaning had already settled quietly inside me. I realized then that the experience hadn't taken me away from ordinary life. It had returned me to it. More attentive, more patient, more present. And that presence felt like the beginning of something steady, not sudden. Something that wouldn't announce itself, but would quietly shape how I moved through each day. For a while I kept everything to myself. Not because I feared being misunderstood, but because the experience had arrived with such calm that rushing to explain it felt wrong. Some understandings need time to breathe before they're shared. But over the days that followed I began to notice something. People spoke in familiar ways. I feel unsettled but I don't know why. Things that used to motivate me don't anymore. I feel like I'm waiting for something but I can't name it. Each time I heard those words, something inside me recognized them. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I listened. And in listening I understood why I had been shown what I was shown. Not to predict. Not to persuade. But to reassure. In the quiet days that followed, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Mornings asked for attention again. Conversations resumed their usual pace. Responsibilities waited patiently for me to rejoin them. And I did. Nothing external had changed. My work was the same. My routines were the same. The world had not rearranged itself to match what I had experienced. Yet something subtle had shifted. My need to figure everything out had loosened. Someone asked me a few days later, "Do you understand what all of this means now?" I paused longer than I normally would have. "I understand how to be present," I said. "The rest can unfold." That answer surprised me. Before this experience, not knowing had always felt uncomfortable, like standing on uncertain ground. Now it felt spacious, like standing in an open field without needing to decide which direction to run. I noticed this most when plans changed unexpectedly. When conversations didn't go as planned. When silence lingered longer than usual. Instead of tightening inside, I softened. In quiet moments I began to ask myself gently, does this require action or attention? The answer never arrived as words. It came as ease or tension or a quiet sense of settling. I realized then that guidance doesn't always explain itself. Sometimes it simply helps you recognize what feels steady. I stopped thinking about the future as something to prepare for anxiously. I began to think of it as something to meet attentively. When I rushed, my body noticed. My thoughts scattered. When I slowed, clarity returned on its own. Living with this awareness didn't mean withdrawing from life. It meant entering it more honestly without forcing certainty where patience was needed. Over time something else became clear. This understanding was not meant to travel loudly. It wasn't meant to be repeated as a message or shared as a conclusion. It was meant to be lived quietly, moment by moment, in ordinary situations. I noticed how people responded more to calm than to explanation. How reassurance often came from presence, not words. When someone around me felt unsettled, I didn't rush to interpret their experience. I stayed with them. I listened. I allowed pauses. "You don't seem worried," someone said to me once. "I don't feel rushed anymore," I replied. And that felt true. I understood then that carrying this understanding forward didn't mean retelling what I had experienced. It meant embodying it. Choosing faith when fear would have been easier. Choosing prayer when distraction offered escape. Choosing love when certainty felt tempting. The awareness I carried wasn't something I checked each day. It surfaced naturally when life pulled me off balance and quietly guided me back. I learned that faith does not demand constant reassurance. It rests in trust. That prayer does not need to be filled with words to be sincere. That love for God does not rush to prove itself. It remains. Trusting this awareness also meant allowing others their own pace. Their own questions. Their own timing. The experience did not give me confidence about outcomes. It gave me comfort with uncertainty. And that comfort, steady and grounded, felt like something that could quietly support others without ever needing to announce itself. So I move forward this way now. Listening more. Reacting less. Meeting each moment as it comes. Not because I have answers, but because I've learned how to remain present while they unfold. And in that presence I've come to trust something simple and enduring. That salvation is not found in urgency. It is found in faith that stays. In prayer that listens. In love that remains steady even when the way forward feels unclear. And sometimes, the gentlest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Hold.